Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Don and Ed, for that talk. We're now moving on to the privacy is always a necessity talk. Thanks to an omnipresent culture of abusing privacy, there is currently a consumer trust crisis for tech companies. Let's explore the absolute need for privacy today with Jennifer Strong, Editorial Director of MIT Technology Review, and Proton's founder and CEO, Andy Yen.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this morning.
Yeah.
My name is Jennifer Strong. I'm an audio reporter in New York City, which at the moment, the whole island of Manhattan is covered in these Apple ads about privacy, which is a reminder that, you know, there's a lot of ways to think about that word. It does not mean the same thing to everybody, and we're going to dig into that for the next 20 minutes or so. I am really pleased to be joined on stage by a global leader in the privacy movement, really. And Andy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and coming here today. My name is Andy Yen. I'm the founder and CEO of Proton. We're a company that is all about privacy. But in my perspective, I think a more genuine and authentic version of privacy. A bit about what we do. Proton's mission really is to change the way that we do business online. Today, if we look at the internet, it's dominated by a small number of large tech giants in US and also in China that really have business models that are putting profits ahead of people. And this gives rise to things like surveillance capitalism, which is now the dominant business online. So Proton is really about finding a different way to do business online that is maybe more responsible and really putting people's needs first.
Let's talk a bit about you, though, and back up a step, because he's actually a physicist. So how did you get from there to here?
Yeah, this is a very common question that people ask when they talk about Proton's story and its history, right? My PhD is in particle physics. I studied supersymmetry. It seems like a completely different field. But if you go back to the history of CERN, where I was working, so CERN's the European Organization for Nuclear Research, actually, the connection with internet and web goes back more than 30 years. One of our advisory board members today is actually Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And Sir Tim was actually the creator of the web. And what many people don't realize was the web was actually created at CERN as a tool to allow scientists to communicate. So having Proton as a privacy business coming out of CERN is really actually bringing things full circle, because it's actually taking the web and the internet back to the original vision that Sir Tim had when he created at CERN over 30 years ago.
Yep, fascinating. But for you, what was the moment that you said, OK, I'm going to work in privacy? I'm curious how you got from there to there.
Yeah. Well, as a physicist at CERN, you, of course, know the whole history. The web is always there in the background. And what we saw in 2014 when Proton first started was the internet, the web, and the way that it was evolving wasn't really going in the right direction. The problem was you had an internet ecosystem that was dominated by a small number of players. You had business models that were really about exploiting users. And if this trend were to continue, you really have issues with democracy, you have issues with freedom, and many things that we saw in 2016 and onwards with Cambridge Analytica, all that really came to pass. So as a scientist, your overriding goal is try to solve hard and interesting problems. And fixing the fundamental privacy issue was actually, in my mind, one of the most relevant and interesting problems, and it still is today.
Yeah. Although I'm wondering, because you brought it back to CERN again, but I was thinking maybe your childhood had something to do with this. Were you thinking more about governments? These days, it feels like you're talking more about tech, and big tech in particular, but it feels like maybe you started somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's really a big connection, right? All the tech companies, whether it's the US tech companies or the Chinese tech companies, they are beholden in many ways to the laws and regulations where they're based. And my background, well, my family is originally from Taiwan, right? That's my heritage. And of course, coming from Taiwan, you realize very quickly the issue with democracy, and you realize how important it is to have freedom of speech and privacy. We have now seen in recent years what has happened in Hong Kong. And this is really maybe a precursor of what could happen in the future for Taiwan. And that's something, of course, that concerns people a lot, right? If you look at the information that's available online through tech companies that governments have access to, and you compare it to, say, East Germany in the late 80s, the amount of information that governments can access today, far exceeds what was possible, even 20, 30 years ago. And this trend is accelerating. And I have to say, COVID really accelerated that to a massive degree. So, internet, what previously was maybe a beacon of freedom and hope, is now today often a tool of oppression and control, right? And governments are leveraging that. Maybe not here in Canada, maybe you don't see this in the US so much, but definitely in places like China, in places like Russia, Belarus, Myanmar, we see this trend strongly increasing. And I think that's something that if we don't reverse now, will lead to a dramatic backsliding of democracy in the 21st century.
Now, something I want to ask you about, I feel like, at least throughout my career, it's been this conversation of privacy versus, it's not really just privacy, it's privacy versus security, privacy versus competition. How do you see sort of this evolution, and what are your thoughts?
It's very interesting because when we first started the business in 2014, many governments viewed us as an opponent, right? Proton was a threat. The fact that you could have, encrypted email that governments couldn't read was something dangerous and to be worried about. And this is really a reflection of the long-term struggle between privacy and security. People tend to think about these as opposing concepts, but what I think reality and what people begin to realize is they're actually two sides of the same coin. And the kind of maybe the ending part of the story is the same governments that in 2014 felt maybe a bit threatened by what we were doing. A lot of these same government organizations are now Proton customers. And they become Proton customers because they have an overriding need to protect data in a very risky cyber environment. So I think the thinking on this has really shifted and advanced in the past 8 years. But it's not by any means the end of the discussion, right? These things continue to come up, I think, year after year. And there's always that fundamental friction. And I think navigating that is one of the big things that privacy and tech companies need to be able to figure out in the 21st century. There's no silver bullet. There's no black and white solution. There's no, this is the way to do it, and this is not the other way. But I think we need to have ongoing discussions, civil society, private businesses, and also customers and users around the world.
Yeah. Well, to that end, the privacy versus competition or antitrust conversation is very much ongoing. Do you want to talk about what you're doing there?
Yeah, that's a very relevant topic because today, a couple things have happened this year, right? First, in March of this year, Europe passed something called the Digital Markets Act, DMA for short. And this is one of the largest regulatory competition overhauls that has ever been attempted in Europe, really since the beginning of the EU. And this was approved in March of this year and will come into law. So that's what's happening on the European side. At the same time, literally right this moment, we have two pieces of legislation advancing through the US Congress that could potentially come up for a vote anytime in the next couple weeks. And the significance of this should not be understated. And the good way to understand this is to see how strongly big tech is fighting this, right? Big tech has gone to the length of running advertisements on TV in the districts of vulnerable Democrats to try to get them to postpone this vote. And I think, and the total spending on these ads is over 30 million. So this shows kind of how afraid big tech is of the new regulations that are coming into force. And this is something that we as consumers and customers should be championing because the internet ecosystem today is fundamentally broken, right? We are here with many startups at this event, but actually startups today are really struggling to gain traction because we're fighting in a completely unlevel playing field. And I can just give two examples that not just impact Proton, but actually many companies around the world. Let's take Android, for example, or even iOS, right? Today, if you're a company and you want to be present on these mobile app stores, the only way to be present is to actually agree to pay 30% of your mobile revenue to Google and to Apple. And first of all, there are not that many industries with a 30% profit margin, right? But can you imagine fair competition in a world where us, Proton, needs to pay our biggest competitor, Google, 30% of our revenue. There's no universe in which you can compete fairly there. Another area where I think the playing field is very tilted is actually the issue of defaults, right? We're in a mobile-first world, but everybody that buys a mobile phone is going to have Gmail, Google Drive, Google Search, Google Chrome, all of these products preloaded by default. And if you want to try to change one of these defaults, I challenge you to try. It's extremely difficult. You have to go through 5 menus. It's a very complicated UX. And the result is 95% of people don't change the defaults. And if we don't have legislation and regulation that tackles this issue, what we're basically saying is we're going to concede to tech giants 95% of the market, and everybody else can go after the last 5%. And this is an issue because first it's bad for innovation, because if you don't have competition, there's no innovation. And without this, long term, there's no economic growth as well. So for, I think, both Europe and the US, it's an economic issue. But it's also a competitive issue, because if you look across, to say, at China, China is moving very fast in bringing antitrust and competition regulations, because they recognize that if the Chinese tech industry is dominated by a small number of tech companies, it's also a long-term innovation problem. So I think it's long overdue, and if these bills were to pass, for consumers, we all win, right? There's lower prices, there's more variety, there's better products, and ultimately also better privacy, because privacy and competition, in reality, actually are the same issue.
Interesting. Can you unpack that a little bit? I feel like that's one thing we've sort of glossed around so far.
Sure. So there's an interesting FTC lawsuit against Facebook right now. And I think in that lawsuit, there's a very clear argument for why privacy and competition are so related. And Facebook is a great example. Let's say you don't like Facebook's privacy practices. In fact, I don't know of anybody that likes the way Facebook treats data, right? They have the most atrocious track record. They're breaking every single imaginable law. They've been fined in multiple jurisdictions. How are they still around? Well, they're still around because if you don't like what Instagram, Facebook, or WhatsApp is doing, what is your alternative, right? Are you going to move all your social media to TikTok, which sends data to Beijing, allegedly, right? Is that going to be a good option? You really have no alternative. And what the FTC is trying to prove, and I think is very obvious, is Facebook doesn't have an incentive to improve your privacy because there's nowhere else that you can go. They can do whatever they want, because no matter how bad their privacy abuses are, no matter how many Cambridge Analytica scandals they have, no matter what they do to your data, you're a captive audience that cannot go anywhere else. And if there were 3 or 4 or 5 different social media companies, and some of them were much better with their data and had similar reach and similar ability to scale, probably we wouldn't be on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. We would be picking alternatives. So this is a very good example that the best way to get tech companies to be more private is just simply to have more choices, right? We want consumers to decide, because ultimately all of us, all of you in the audience, you care about privacy. And that's very, very clear. So if you have the choice, you will choose privacy, and that will force tech companies to also adopt. So in my perspective, and I think this is something that both the EU and also the US is recognizing, the best way to solve privacy is through competition.
You're making me think of something here, and that is that we all seem to agree that messaging should be end-to-end encrypted, right? Even my kids know, messages should be encrypted. But we don't really have that type of conversation or awareness around our email or our calendar. And why is that? Is it just because there hasn't been an option, or is there something else?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with the disconnect between, let's say, the real world and the digital world, right? Let's kind of imagine what Google is doing on a day-to-day basis, right? In the real world, if you're walking around, let's say, at Collision or going about your daily lives, and there is somebody following you, making a record of everything you do, photographing everything that you're looking at, reading all your communications and recording all your conversations, you would be terrified. You would never accept that, right? You would say, this is horrifying, this is unacceptable, this is the worst setup in the world, worst product ever. But because it's happening online, it's invisible. these same things are happening in the digital world, but you don't see it. And actually, the invisible surveillance is in many ways the most insidious one, because you don't even realize that it's happening. So I think the reason that we maybe are more lax with online privacy is because we don't see it in the same way, but it is actually just as present, and it's even more dangerous because if you know you're being watched, you at least can take some precautions, right? But if you don't see the camera, then you're much more likely to do something that you wouldn't want to get recorded and get embarrassed later, right? So I think this is it's a human psychology thing. But it's very important that we get this message across. And I think over time, people begin to realize this. You do a Google search for something, or you have an email about a wedding, and you start seeing wedding advertisements. The awareness does go up over time, but it's not the same level as in the physical world. But I think over time, we will see the emergence, because the physical and the digital world, they're really becoming one and the same.
Yeah. Are there partners, are there companies out there that you trust in this space?
Well, I would say it's more about not who I trust, but what I look for, the indicators of trust, right? And one thing that's very important, I believe, in privacy space is just being open source, because anybody can say, oh, we're a privacy company, but until you actually have the ability to see the source code, have it publicly audited, have it checked, you really don't know, right? The second indicator of trust is what I call alignment of incentives and business models. And Google is a very good example of this. Today, when you're a Google user, you're not Google's actual customer. What you are is the product they're selling to the real customers, which is the advertisers. And this is a fundamental misalignment of interest that makes it difficult for Google, despite whatever they say, to really put your interests first. Because ultimately, you're not who pays them, right? So I think the companies that you can trust are also the ones who have a very clear business model, and you can really understand that they're supported by their users, and their only incentive is to advance their users' privacy. So these are the indicators of trust, and if you can see those in businesses, then those are the ones that you probably can trust.
Yeah. I'm thinking about companies like DuckDuckGo, Signal. Do you collaborate, or is there a conversation happening between the companies we generally think of as the privacy companies?
Yeah, for sure. There's so few of us in the giant internet ecosystem. I think it's important that we communicate, work together, support each other, and advance a common vision, right? At the end of the day, it's about communicating to the world what privacy actually means and making the case. This is kind of an interesting point, because if you look at Apple, if you look at Google, if you look even at Facebook, what they're telling you today is we're privacy first, we believe in privacy. But when Facebook or Google say they're private, it means a very different thing, right? When Google tells you we care about your privacy, what they're actually saying is, what privacy means to us is nobody can exploit your data except for us. And that's not what privacy means. What privacy really means is nobody can exploit your data, period. And I think the other companies you mentioned, working together to convey that message is extremely important, because what we don't want is to have the tech giants of the world redefine what privacy means, essentially move the goalposts, and then leave all of us as consumers off in a much worse world.
Yeah. Well, we are just about out of time, so final word here. Is there anything we've missed?
No, I think it was a great session. We covered a lot of interesting information. I'm around at Collision for at least the rest of today. So happy to speak to you all later, and hopefully meet some of the users out there as well. So thanks a lot for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.